So I'm going to tell you my story, and I'll try to draw out some specific lessons that I learned about women. My mother called me her miracle baby. As a Jewish child, born in 1941 Poland, to Jewish parents, I'm one of a rare breed who survived to tell about it. Most of my contemporaries were murdered. Those who, like me, lived were hidden by kind Christians or passed as Aryans. Now, many of you are aware that Germany invaded Poland in 1939, and when you normally ask someone, what were the years of the Holocaust? 1939 to 1945. But it was different years at different times. In fact, I just met a gentleman before we started tonight who reminded me that in Hungary, the Jews were not deported to Auschwitz until 1944. They did a good job. Guess them all. In the part of Poland where I was born, in a city called Stanisławów, a city of 75,000 in 1939, about 1/3 were Jews, 25,000. About 30,000 were Poles, about 15,000 were Ukrainians, and then there was a mix of Armenians, Hungarians, Romanians, Muslims. It was a multicultural city, and everybody got along. They weren't best friends, but they did business together. They were neighbors. But the Nazis changed all that. So when did Germany actually invade? They invaded Stanisławów in 1941. Before that, Germany and the USSR had something called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Some of you know about. And they came to an agreement. You guys, you Germans, you can have the major part of Poland, and we Russians will have the southeast part of Poland. Which was okay with my parents, because the 1930s was a hard time for young people to find jobs. And when the USSR invaded, both my parents, who were professionals, my dad was an engineer, my mom was a pharmacist, they got good jobs. They figured it was time to get married, have a kid, and start a family. Unfortunately, 5 months after I was born, in March 1941, the Nazis invaded. And there went their dreams up in a puff of smoke. First, they started to implement some of the laws that you've heard about before, which I won't go into, because the very first major Aktion, as they called it, was on October 12th, 1941, known as Black Sunday. 12,000 Jews were corralled and marched to the new Jewish cemetery, where a huge pit was dug. They were told to remove their clothing and line up row by row, and were shot into the pit. Now this, interestingly enough, has recently been documented by a priest, Father Patrick Desbois. Has anyone heard of him? A wonderful man whose book, Holocaust by Bullets, A Priest's Journey to Uncover the Truth Behind the Murder of 1.5 million Jews, has come upon this method of putting a count to the number of Jews who were actually killed in the towns, villages of Eastern Europe, because we have a pretty good count in the extermination camps, but there wasn't one for these, because the Germans, the Nazis, were only allowed to use 1 bullet per victim. In our city, the head honcho said, well, these guys, they're young. Many of them were young Ukrainian and German officers. They didn't use their best soldiers for this. They weren't the best shots. So we got to apply them with a lot of vodka so that they'll feel like even the nastiest kind of police officers and didn't want to shoot people all day, but they plied them with vodka, and the guys who weren't good shots to start with began to be even worse shots, and some people ended up in those pits, not even dead. And in fact, Father Desbois claims that he taught, because he was a priest, people talked to him. And some of the really old people who still survived, who were witnesses, said, oh yeah, those graves were heaving. And they used us kids to stomp them down so that they could get more bodies in. So how did my parents and I escape this event? Well, they lived in a non-Jewish neighborhood. They waited all day for the boots to tromp up the stairs and grab them, and they didn't come. So we were lucky at the time. However, we didn't escape the ghetto. Subsequently, all these laws were put in place where Jews had to turn in all their valuables. I found it fascinating to hear that my parents had to turn in their skis, their bicycles, their typewriter, their radios, and they were allowed to take one suitcase each into the ghetto. And the ghetto consisted of an area of 1/8 of the territory of the city with 3 main gates, and 20,000 people were crammed into it. Huge overcrowding. We were in an apartment with 3 or 4 other families. Increasingly, the Germans wanted to get rid of the Jews on site. It was very expensive to get them into these cattle cars and ship them all the way up to the closest extermination camp, which was Belzec. So they cut off all electricity, they shut down the water pump, there was no basic sanitation, people were dying in the streets from disease and starvation, and unpredictable Aktionen. My father said if they came out shooting at 2 o'clock one afternoon, the next day it would be 8 o'clock in the morning. And as soon as they heard the stomping boots, people went into hiding. The only way to avoid this is if you got yourself onto slave labor, which both my parents managed to do. My father worked in, the Nazis set up these recycling plants outside the ghetto. My father worked in the scrap metal recycling. My mother worked in clothing recycling, and all this was sent back to Germany for the war effort. So who looked after me? My mother made an arrangement with one of the other women in this apartment crowded with people who was my father's cousin's wife. She also had a child, and my mother would bring the food back because there was no food in the ghetto. It was a pretty brisk trade outside the ghetto wall with the locals. My mother still had stuff from her trousseau in that suitcase, which went for food outside the ghetto wall. One day when there was an action, and this woman, of course, went to hide with her child. People didn't want to hide with children. Children make noise, they cry. One little boy was suffocated with a pillow because he was crying. Another little child, my parents said they saw him being bashed against the wall, split his head like a ripe watermelon. So she went to hide with her child, but she gave me phenobarb. My mother was a pharmacist and left her phenobarb to put me to sleep so I'd be quiet. Well, the police stomped up to the apartment. The guy pointed the gun at my head, but the other, his superior said, and don't bother with her. He thought I was my father's cousin's child. The cousin was an architect. He was helping the Nazis build the factories outside the ghetto wall. So they left me alone till next time. So, and he, by the way, and his family were killed also when he was no longer useful to the Nazis. My mom was very upset at what was happening. One day she came back with the food and she saw this poor woman feeding her own child my portion. And my mother used to say to me, and she would always tear up, so I couldn't talk to her about it. She'd say, you look so sad. And when I came in, you were so happy to see me. So she knew she had to get me out. Things were getting worse. In the fall of 1942, a year later, On September 22nd, 4,000 Jews were transported to Belzec. On October 15, 5,000 were transported. My mother decided she had to smuggle me out. So she wrapped me up in this big comforter. She had a cousin at the main gate. The Nazis used Jews as policemen and guards too. I mean, this guy ended up being, when they didn't find him useful anymore, they killed him too. So he agreed that when she went with the slave labor group, he gave her a nod and she went behind his back. She ripped off, they didn't wear the yellow star, they had a white band with a blue star on it. She ripped it off and she ran to a Polish neighbor's house. There, she had arranged to meet a maid, a woman who used to be a maid in her brother's house. And from there, I was taken to this woman's widowed sister in a little village called Puzhniki, where she looked after me. She became my mother, my foster mother. She was very poor. She had 2 sons, and she lived in, I guess the best word for it is a hovel. So one big room with a thatched roof. And her boys were not too happy to share their mother's attention with me. At first they used to tease me, and at one point they collected the cigarette butts that the Germans had dropped in the yard, and they gave me the wrong end, and I still have the souvenir of that. But it was nothing serious, because eventually they got to like their little sister. I would say they even loved me. I was cute. I was blonde and blue-eyed, and they took me to church with them, and they had a big black dog, and the dog used to follow me around. And whenever a German soldier came by, he barked like hell. But then, before that happened, I have to tell you what happened at the ghetto. In the ghetto, in the meantime, my mother was hiding in the attic of this next-door neighbor, and my father could see things were coming to an end, so he escaped. He stole a horse from the scrap metal yard, and he met this woman, and they escaped. And when he arrived where my mother was, you'd think she was happy to see him? No. She was furious. I don't really know exactly why, but if you look at the picture, my father had thick black hair, which of course there was no barber, so it was thick and hung like this, and a thick black beard. He looked like a stereotypical Jew, and she said, "You're going to cause all of us to be killed." So he had to find another place to hide. And eventually, the ghetto was declared Judenrein. That means cleaned out of all Jews. And he says he even saw the signs going up before he ran away. But they were worried. They could both see me through the peepholes in the attics. I wasn't walking at 2 years old. So my mother took out the last gold coin she had sewed into the hem of her dress, gave it to Marina, my caregiver. "Go buy a goat. The child needs milk." Well, I had milk, but also the boys made sure I ate well. The staple diet was like the Irish diet, potatoes. So nobody could touch the bowl of potatoes. The little one had to have the first potato and the last potato. When the Russians liberated us in the middle of summer of 1944, I wouldn't go to my parents. I didn't recognize them. So what they did was they went back to Stanislavov in their rags and in bare feet, managing to catch a ride with a Russian truck, soldier's truck, and they got Marina to come a couple of weeks later when they'd settled down. My mother was given a pharmacy to run by the Russians. My father was given a very responsible job in an electrical power station. And gradually the transition was made. Before I finish, be only another couple of minutes, I want to pay tribute to the women heroes of the Holocaust. I want to pay tribute to women like my mother and other mothers who gave away their children for safekeeping. I have children, and I can't imagine giving my children away and not knowing what's going to happen to them. Babies were left on convent steps. I know someone who survived that, whose mother didn't survive. Another child I know whom I know now as an adult was pushed to the side of the road by her mother when they were all marching to the cattle cars. My good friend, who I don't know if she's here or not, her mother arranged for her to be smuggled out of the Warsaw Ghetto in a baby carriage by a Polish woman who piled a bunch of clothes on top of her and just marched out. These are brave women. The second group I want to pay tribute to is the women as fighters. One of them who lived and died in Toronto was Faye Shulman. Some of you may have heard of her. A Jewish partisan photographer, and the only such photographer to photograph struggles in Eastern Europe during the Second World War. And I have on my list, which is on the table of the books that I'm referring to, her memoir, published by Second Story Press, A Partisan's Memoir, Women of the Holocaust. One that I recently found out about in reading a novel by Lillian Nattell, Lydia Vladimirovna Litviak, also known as Lilia, was a fighter pilot in the Soviet Air Force. Litviak was called the White Lily of Stalingrad in Soviet press releases. The white lily flower may be translated from Russian as Madonna lily. She had courage and guts beyond her years. She was ranked as a senior lieutenant and awarded Hero of the Soviet Union, and was shot down behind enemy lines at 21 years of age. Finally, I want to pay, in this group of fighters, a tribute to a woman from my town, Stanislavov. Anda Luft was a chemical engineer, employee of the Margosha's Tannery and Leather Factory. Toward the end of February 1943, when I told you the ghetto was declared Judenrein, she organized a group of 70 tannery workers fleeing the ghetto. She organized the only partisan unit in Subcarpathia, attacking small groups of German troops. She was pregnant at the time. She became famous for they became famous for the liquidation of the head of the local Gestapo cell, Hauptsturmführer Tausch. Anda Luft was killed on November 5th with her baby daughter. That was in 1943. And finally, I want to pay tribute to the Jews, like my savior, Marina Charisma, and other individuals who saved Jewish children. They took great risks. If they had been found out, they'd been shot on the spot. One in particular who did an amazing job was Irina Sandler. Some of you may have heard of her. A Polish social worker, humanitarian, and nurse who served in the Polish underground during World War II in the German-occupied Warsaw. And from October 1943 was head of the children's section of Żegota, the Polish Council to Aid Jews. She saved 2,500 children. 1.5 million children were murdered by the Nazis. 10% survived. I guess I'm one of the 10%. Thank you.